I'll just mention that this is now the second recording session over a couple of days, which is why we've probably changed clothes and positions in the meantime. So what was it that you mentioned you wanted to get into this time after finishing last time?
Well, I really would like to talk about the science of it. Because as we talked about, science requires more than evidence. I mean, the history of science is, filled with, look at continental drift. Uh, back at the turn of the last century, um, one of the most respected geologists in the world showed that continental drift, through fossil evidence, through geological evidence, um, similar to what goes on today. He had and he had outstanding credentials. This is Dr. Wagner, and he was ridiculed, not believed because he couldn't explain how it happened. His idea was that ocean currents were causing it, which was somewhat absurd to think, that the ocean was going to push the entire continent. Um, it wasn't until they discovered tectonic plates in the 1960s that then they went, oh, he was right after all. And
And we're not talking hundreds of years ago, we're talking recently.
yeah, uh, so I mean that's just the nature of science. It's inherently conservative, uh, but the current paradigm is not sustainable. The idea that the human mind, the human brain, creates consciousness simply has no evidence whatsoever to support it. And there's a reason that, for example, memories um, have not been, we've not even localized where memories are stored in the brain. And there's numerous examples of patients that have had half of their brain removed for one or another reason. They still retain all their memories. I had a patient who had a severe stroke and only had 30% of her brain remaining. And yet she had her sense of humor, she had her same personality, etc. Um, and I'm not saying, obviously there's a thousand opposite examples. The obviously brain function is very important. People get a stroke on, the language areas of the brain, and they can't speak, and such as that. And yet it's these exceptions to the rule, the white crows, as you put it, that give us a hint that something else is going on. And Fred Lashley is sort of the grandfather of modern memory research. And at the end of his career, he said, if it wasn't impossible, at this point, I would conclude that memories are stored outside the brain. So the idea that the brain is an antenna in a universe of information is actually scientific theory, and has been around for 50 years in the theoretical physics literature. Uh, but modern science tells us this about this reality we share. Um, there's a electromagnetic field which stores all the information in the universe. John Wheeler famously said, "The universe is information," and it. Um, so, what is this? What is this experience we're having? Our body has, bioelectric sensors. We sense, with our, ears, eyes, uh, taste, etc. And we take that electromagnetic energy and we translate it into bioelectric signals, which then go to our brain and it's processed. We don't just, our eyes on video cameras. It's then processed. And for probably 30% of our perception um, are actually intermingled with emotion and intermingled with memory. what we expect we should see. So, Neuroscience 101 in the year 2024 is that we create a mental model of reality. And then we're constantly matching that mental model against what we sense in the outside world. Um, so, I've often think that if people want to understand paranormal science or the science of spiritual, they should watch a PBS feature by Dr. Eagleman. It's a six-part series called The Brain. And after you see that, you'll see that this world is truly an illusion. And it's something that we create. And we create it out of what we expect to see. Uh, and we spend a lot of time matching, um, like the color red. When we're 2 and 3 years old, it's drilled into our head. That's red, that's red, that's red, that's red. But that doesn't mean that what I see as red is what you see as red. It means that we've mutually decided that that imprint of reality is red. And that's one of the problems with understanding spiritual experiences, because we don't have that commonality of shared experience. We've not spent a lot of time going, oh, yeah, that's God, that's God, that's God, that's God. Um, and we have so many different cultural definitions for it that it becomes confusing. But nevertheless, um, with this understanding of how the brain works, the only missing piece is, where does consciousness come in? And we're at a time of a paradigm shift now, Darren, because it's a very odd current situation where the general feeling is that science disses spirituality. That these are hallucinations of the brain, that these are not real, the near-death experience, neurochemical reactions at the point of death, and so forth. And a lot of that research, actually, our own group did, but sort of been misunderstood. However, when you look at science, let's take Robert Lanza, arguably the world's smartest scientist. I mean, at age 13, he manipulated the genetics of a chicken over to Harvard, and they said, something, we'd like to continue to work with you. I mean, this guy's clearly brilliant. And it's been over 20 years that he proposed that consciousness is the fundamental principle of the universe. And just more and more evidence is building up along these lines. Most recently is Penrose and Hameroff. They propose that there's tiny tubules in the brain, and that these microtubules are the interface between our biological brain and quantum reality. Um, and, at a time of paradigm shift, we know that when the new evidence comes, either it has to be explained by the scientific explanation, or the new paradigm explains it. And there's been no movement on the part of the materialists as to how all the many diverse situations having to do with death and dying and the survival of consciousness can be explained. Um, so,
Other than that, the experiences don't actually happen.
right, yeah,
Or if they do happen, they're an illusion.
and, and right, and that's why I went through the part that all of this is an illusion. All of this is created by our brain. Everything humans experience is neurochemicals. Um, so those attempts to refute the coming paradigm don't match with modern neuroscience. So, as part of the study, Darren, we looked at 6 things that must be true in order for mediumship to be real. And all 6 of these things that I'm going to briefly go over with you are in fact supported by more modern science. Before I go into that, though, I want to point out that one of the real problems is neuroscientists are not talking to mediums. People like Penrose and Hammeroff, who have these elegant theories of consciousness and how consciousness is independent of the human brain, they're not talking to people who've had near death experiences. Um, so, one of my favorite examples of this is Michael Shermer. And Michael Shermer is sort of a he he's sort of an arch skeptic. Is one is always a very skeptical, and always writes a column for Scientific American, debunking various spiritual things, which actually is a good exercise. There's plenty to do debunk.
And he's the editor of the Skeptic magazine.
Right. You know. So yet several years ago, he wrote an article in which he said that the human soul is simply information, and that we consist of information. Michael Shermer, yes, that's right. We consist of information, information that is embedded in this timeless, spaceless, eternal, infinite electromagnetic field. And so, as such, he is actually saying what we're that the human, everything that makes us human is information, and that information is eternal. And once our brain gets out of the way, um, we can reconnect again with this universal consciousness. So this is the idea that the brain is an antenna, is like a read-write head, as one theoretical physicist proposed 30 years ago. So, so even Michael Shermer, when you look at what he's actually saying, is coming to the conclusion that this universe is eternal, is information, and as such, um, validates spiritual perceptions. So that the first thing I think that we have to establish and has been established is that consciousness survives the death. And people are not familiar with this research. You probably are because you know everything. You're so well informed. But in the United States, in the National Warfare Institute, they took fighter pilots and whirled them in centrifuges to the point of death. And they did this for a simple reason. They don't want their jets to fly faster than pilot. Those fighter pilots went through the same stages of the dying process as the children in my near death experience. In fact, I've compared notes with Jim Winery, who was the lead author on those experiments. And what they show clearly is that as the pilots approach death, they lose consciousness, they have seizures, they, bowel and bladder control are lost. They're completely unconscious. And then when they come to the point of death, consciousness returns. And that's what we saw in our children that we studied with near death experiences. That when we asked them what did they remember about being in the intensive care unit, invariably they would say, well, I don't remember, being taken to the hospital. I don't remember being in the ICU, which fits with modern neurology. Short-term memory is lost with trauma. And then they say, but when you asked the nurses for that crash cart thing, suddenly I was awake and I could see my grandmother, and I was just so shocked to see her. So they again localized their experience right at the point of death. And I don't think that anybody can look at the modern near death literature and reach a conclusion It's published in The Lancet. It's Penn von Lummel's prospective study in adults. And our study, of course, was published in the American Medical Association's pediatric journals. Our study was, but was also the head of the departments of neurology, intensive care medicine, and psychiatry at Seattle Children's Hospital. We are the medical mainstream, and I think that there really is no doubt about it. Mr. Bigelow, before he funded the Mediumship Challenge grant, he had, I think it's 27 people from around the world write essays addressing this issue of life after death. And it's absolutely convincing from a scientific point of view. And I don't see any science that refutes it. Saying that it's neurochemicals at the point of death, yeah, oh, well, that would be, we could argue that this conversation isn't real. This is all just neurochemicals. That's all it is. So that's number one. Consciousness must be independent of brain function. Secondly, is that information must be stored outside of the human mind brain. This comes from theoretical physics. And I think it's very fitting that Hal Puthoff, the physicist, wrote some of the seminal papers on what they call zero point energy. Um, I'm not a physicist, so I'm going to get this wrong, Darren, but my understanding is that there is a level of reality that, will matter, not even a definition. That, reality as we know it is made of quarks, which are electromagnetic um, entities, and electrons, which are also electromagnetic in nature. And that there is a quantum zero point. That these things exist more as probabilities than they do as realities. And well, I don't feel bad about not understanding this. I've read these papers again and again because it has been famously said that if you think you understand theoretical physics, you don't, that because it's too counterintuitive. But that there's a level of reality in which everything is entangled, and the only energetic movement is quantum. So that's a very view of reality than we have. The materialistic paradigm is there's tiny little pieces of matter, and that they grew more and more complex. They evolved into single cell organisms, and then the brain in its complexity then evolves consciousness. This is that there is this single focal point of reality that is conscious, and from there everything evolves, and that there's this greater and much of it is probabilities. So, in other words, for example, everything that we think is so real, when they measure it in the physics lab, every time they look at it, it changes its shape and size. Granted by several micromillimeters, but nevertheless changes its size. And we can interact with this quantum reality. We know any number of studies have shown that the human mind can influence the movement of electrons. Well, electrons create this reality. So the people that do those studies have altered reality, albeit in a very teeny tiny way. Yes, but so but can be measured and can be documented and quantified. So, what is the? I think it's very fitting that Al Puthoff came up with these, and others. I mean, he's not the only one that came up with these theories, but Hal Puthoff then went to show the real life implications of it, in that he developed the controlled remote viewing protocol at Stanford Research Institute. And his psychics, in fact, altered the flow of electrons uh, in the magnetometers that they had in other places at the Stanford Research Institute while they were doing their remote viewing. And the research on remote viewing has been around for 40 years, published in Nature. So let's go back to Michael Shermer. Michael Shermer wrote a great book in which he talked about the borderlands of science. And I know he's like the big skeptic guy. He must have written this book before he became famed as a skeptic, because he outlines the process of how does the science go from being a fringe science to being mainstream. And one of the things he mentions is publications in peer reviewed. So everything I've told you so far, the Lancet, Nature, AMA medical journals, British Medical Journal, and so forth, um, uh, all indicate that near-death studies and the neuroscience of spirituality is now mainstream. So that's point number two: is that information must be stored outside the human brain, and remote viewing, uh, I think, validates that. One problem is, as a famous skeptic said about remote viewing, he said, "I've seen the research; it's solid. I just don't believe it." And I can concur with that. I had to learn to remote view myself before I believed that it was real. It's just, it's, I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're the most spiritual guru. I've taught that some of them to remote view, and they go, "Holy shit, it's true." Because after all, and for your listeners, what it is we give someone a number, a 9-digit number that contains, it's linked, let's say to the information that's the Eiffel Tower. And sure enough, you can, if you go through the remote viewing protocol, you can retrieve all the information from that remote site that you have no ordinary way of knowing. So, this idea that information is stored outside the brain is validated both with clinical research and theoretical research. So, the next step is that we must be able to, for mediumship to be real, we must be able to interact with this information. And that this information, as Michael Shermer himself, actually, I'm guided by Michael Shermer much more than I think that he probably understands, given his extreme skeptical sort of veneer. But if you look at his work, it's very interesting. And, that idea that the human personality is information that is stored in this reality, and that we can communicate with that, we have definitively shown in our study. We had our mediums, as part of vetting them, we asked them to do things like communicate with living people. Um, for example, one of our mediums, uh, we gave her a number, a target number that was associated with a living human being who was in the hospital. And, but again, she, and we didn't even cue her. We just said, we'd like you to work this number, without telling her, whether it had to do with finding a lost dog or, whether it was part of our study or what have you. And she did, in fact, work the number. And she contacted a living human being in a hospital. And we then went to the woman who was contacted and we said, "What was the experience like for you?" And she said, "I was in my hospital room. And I suddenly heard a voice saying hello. And I looked around and there was, and I felt somebody touch my arm. and then reassure me that my daughter would be there soon, which was, in fact, everything that our medium had done. One of our other mediums successfully contacted a comatose patient, was able to influence his care by letting his family know that there were certain pieces of music that he would like to have played, certain things that he didn't like that irritated him about his environment, etc. When he came out of coma, he reported all of those things, uh, and the physicians involved with this have all gone on record as saying, "Yeah, all that stuff happened." So again, I mean, science progresses by evidence, and evidence is. And the first time that we knew there was meteors was when French farmers said, "Hey, gigantic rocks are falling out of the sky," and of course, they weren't believed. But nevertheless, it starts with those observations, and then as the evidence accumulates, and as it's accumulating now, has to be explained. I think there simply is no way of getting around that there's ample documentation that human beings are able to access this informational reality. Um, Now, in order for this to happen, reality has to be itself an integrated system that's independent of time and space. So, as Dr. Lanza pointed out 20 years ago, that in time and space are created by the human brain. And modern neuroscience agrees with that, and theoretical physicists agree with that. So, so much of the current scientific thinking supports mediumship or, you know, after death communications, premonitions of death, have you, but it just hasn't been integrated meaningfully yet. One of the most important studies, again, they're all in little crevices. Dr. Winnery's research, experimental evidence that consciousness survives the death of the brain, is published in the aerospace journals. Well, researchers at in England, um, they heard all of this business about spiritual healing and stuff like that, and they said, okay, since the nature of reality uh, is without time or space, um, we're going to have spiritual healing done in the past. We're going to see if we can influence the past. And they had rabbis pray over, they used as their target septic patients, which has a very high mortality rate, and uh, they did not. They just took patients who were diagnosed with sepsis, but they did not look at the outcome because, as we know from theoretical physics, once you observe something, probability coalesces into reality. So they just looked at I can't remember how many charts, but hundreds of charts, and then they'd add half by rabbi, and these are all charts in the past. And uh, in fact, when they then looked at who lived and who died, their prayed over patients lived to a statistical significant manner. And this was published in the British Medical Journal. So, I mean, yet, yeah, but, as yet, simply, I rarely see that study referenced because it's just too mind-boggling. I mean, I'm always seeing these, papers on, the prayer and whether prayer can affect heart attack patients and such as that. And yet, 10 years ago, an infectious disease specialist published in the British Medical a impeccably done study documenting that praying over people in the past makes a difference. So, I think that this concept of reality as being some sort of structured event, independent of time and space, is well developed. Um, I'm looking at where we are on time. I gotta just because there's since there's so much to be integrated. I know I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you that are really just discordant pieces, but they must be integrated. So, coming back to the issue of that ultimate reality must be a coherent system that we somehow integrate with, brings up the issue of what are known as 1 over F fluctuations. And 1 over F is a mathematical term that I'm never going to be able to understand. I've had many, many people try to explain it to me. Uh, we have Harvard neuroscientists working with us. Uh, they just don't want their name involved with a study on mediumship. Um, but these are the best explanation is that they're fractals, but they're over time instead of a fractal dimensional concept. That they're an inherent rhythm that is found in all aspects of reality, a single unifying principle. And 1 over F fluctuations were first discovered in the physical sciences. So they came out of studies in the hard physical sciences over that at the heart of magnetism, in the heart of the structure of granite, in the heart of metals and material science, even the mathematical properties of just piling sand, just a big pile of sand, and you just keep adding sand to it until finally, there's a sand slide. Um, they find these same unique rhythms and patterns when they look at the mathematics, mathematical models of how those things occur. Well, 1 over F patterns are found throughout every aspect of reality. Water dripping from a faucet. That's what chaos mathematicians are spending all their time doing, measuring the drips and showing how the time interval between the drips nicely match 1 over F rhythms. And 1 over F rhythms are also, when set to music, some of the most beautiful music that they're inherently pleasing. And many composers instinctively create music with 1 over F rhythms. Um, However, even the movement of cars on the freeway, internet traffic, everything has been shown with 1 over F rhythms and the functioning of the human brain. And there's an enormous amount of clinical evidence now that disruptions in the normal firing, so in other words, the firing of neurons is not chaotic and it's not uh, random. But when they carefully time the intervals as each one is firing, it's according to these same principles. And even the same mathematics that determines when a system of putting sand on a pile of sand, when will that collapse? Those same mathematical patterns describe the function of the human brain, and it's been shown that the best function of the human brain is when we're in that subcritical state before the sand mountain starts to disintegrate. And when normal 1 over F rhythms are lost, we see cerebral palsy, we see seizure disorders, uh, autism, any number of clinical problems have been related to this. So, just to quickly review, science does support the idea that consciousness survives bodily death. in both clinical and experimental studies in the world's most prestigious journals. Um, the concept that information is stored inside of the human brain has been around in theoretical physics for years. John Wheeler famously said, the universe is information, and that it's timeless and spaceless. Time and space are properties of the human mind. We have to be able to have some way of interacting with this inner informational universe. Viewing shows us that it's possible. Um, our mediums contacting other consciousness shows that it's possible. Uh, and we know that there's well defined mathematical rhythms, I guess is the best way to understand it. They're fractals over time, not in space. And these rhythms clearly unify the universe, including our brain. And since our brain is enmeshed in the universe, the rhythms that from our brain obviously are in connection with these other rhythms. Um, and I made the point that Michael Shermer says for this to be a mainstream science, it's got to be in mainstream literature. Well, the idea that that the universe is conscious and that we can connect to it, and that there's actually experimental evidence showing that our brain has these tiny microtubules tubules that are capable of interacting with quantum reality. You can read that in Popular Mechanics. You don't have to read the New Age Journal anymore. The Guru Monthly. Anything you want to read that I've mentioned so far, you can read in Popular Mechanics. That's how mainstream and well established this is. So there's only two more things left to show. One is, and granted this is speculative, so is clusters of information that are eternal, correspond with us as human beings, must also have a consciousness that uh, that it's not just information, but
That self
it's
awareness.
a yeah, it's a self awareness. It's the perfect way to look at it, and plenty of clinical evidence to show this. The near death experience, which I consider to be the gold standard of scientific research and spirituality, there again and again and again they say, saw my dead relative, saw my dead, father. I saw, and so there's certainly plenty of reason to believe that these discarnate clusters of information retain their consciousness. And then the final thing is that if I'm going to say that the brain is an antenna, which I think adequate research to strongly suggest that, um, we have the neurobiological structures to communicate with this informational universe. And I proposed this in 2004. I said that there's a God spot in our right temporal lobe that connects us with the universe. Since then, Darren, there's only been one pushback. There's only one person who said I was wrong, and that's Mario Beauregard from the University of Montreal. And he says, no, no, it's not a God spot, it's a God brain. And so neurotheology has come into its own now. And, we have, just as we have the brain structures to allow us to move arms and legs, and we have brain structures that interpret visual input and create auditory sensations. We have plenty of neurological hardware that permits us to interact with this universe. And again, this is the problem of integration. That information that I just shared with you has been known for over 150 years. It's been known in the medical literature that people, for example, who have right temporal lobe seizures think that they're communicating with God. The only problem was is that the researchers involved didn't believe in God. So they, but that's just their philosophy. We have to look at the evidence and strip their philosophy from it. However, if anybody doubts the reality of this, Wilder Penfield, who is the father of modern neurosurgery, here's how he learned how our brains work. He took he took electric probes and stimulated different areas of the brain in patients who are undergoing neurological procedures. When you have brain surgery, you're conscious because the brain doesn't just interprets pain. So he stimulate the motor cortex. People move their arm, uh, and when he stimulated the areas of the right temporal lobe and the areas that Dr. Beauregard has identified as being spiritual, um, they said things like, "Oh God, I'm leaving my body," or even more intriguing, "I'm half in and I'm half out." So Wilder Penfield definitively documented this, that there's areas of the brain that allow us to um, communicate with God. And Michael Persinger of Laurentian University in Canada, one of the people that works with our team, Dr. Giona, actually worked with Dr. Persinger, and they actually even God helmet that can stimulate various areas of the brain, and people can have spiritual experiences. So, I mean, I think that the science is solid. As I've reviewed it with you, it's unfortunately in many different areas. The people who study brain subcriticality and 1 over F rhythms in the brain are not the same material scientists who see 1 over F patterns in the flow of electrons uh, in magnetic magnetic you know iron magnets, I guess I should say. The people that have well documented that that death is just a body problem. um, yeah, I really, Dr. Winter's work is, gold standard. He brought people to the point of death. They were unconscious, and boom, when at the point of death, consciousness.
Mm. And it's quite interesting
So,
because that study is often referenced by skeptics to explain away the especially out of body experiences as hypoxia.
yeah, that's quite the stretch. um, I think that, sure, I'm glad you brought that up, Darren. So, when we're looking at the science of the new paradigm, I would guess that we're in phase three. Thomas Kuhn is, a scientific philosopher. He's looked at the numerous paradigm shifts over, the last thousands of years, and he says there comes a point where the evidence is so overwhelming that it can't be explained by the current model. And so the either something new has to come to explain it, or the old model has to, you know, buck up and figure it out. And they're not doing it. I mean, our study from Seattle Children's Hospital showed definitively that a lack of oxygen to the brain does not cause these experiences. Navy divers, there's an enormous amount of literature on rapture of the deeps and what happens to people when they become hypoxic, because a lot of these studies come out of the military. They're not having out of body experiences and seeing God. They're simply not. And I understand that. I uh, that skeptics attempt to use Dr. Winery's research. Dr. Winery himself does not. Dr. Winery himself clearly has stated, for example, BBC did um, a brief, report on his work, and they presented it as, "Oh, see, it's just in the brain." And Dr. told me that they distorted words, they took his words out of context, and they frankly just ignored his numerous statements that his research uh, precisely dovetails with near-death research. And he and I, as I told you, compared notes and agreed. Uh, so those are the desperate last gasps of the outdated materialistic paradigm, and and the, they cling to it. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's what keeps us from pseudoscience. That's to give them credit. I mean, not to give them credit, but to show their point of view. Um, After X-rays were discovered and documented in the literature, the world went crazy discovering N waves. And there's over 50 articles in the scientific literature on these mysterious N waves, which were thought to be something like X rays. And that research fizzled out. There were, in fact, no N waves. That was just well meaning scientists uh, trying to fit the evidence into something it doesn't fit. That is not what's happening today. We are not seeing the science of spirituality and the nerves of spirituality fizzle out. It is getting more robust all the time. And, as soon as we have the heads of the departments, uh, you know, retire and the young neuroscientists, start to take their place, we'll see the conclusion of the paradigm shift that
Well, as the saying goes, science progresses one funeral at a time.
I'm glad you said that, Darren. I never like to say that, but that is actually. I mean, if that's true for syphilis, remember penicillin came along, and overnight, syphilis was no longer a clinical problem. But you had hundreds of scientists who built their careers on complex treatments of syphilis. Well, they have mortgages. They want to be the chairman of the department. They want to send their kids to private school. They're not going to give up easily. Um, Science, unfortunately, we're human beings too, and we're influenced by those kinds of factors as well. But I want to emphasize, we had to fight with the foundation to have our scientific analysis included in our report because they, understandably enough, just wanted the answers to their 4 questions. And I think that our technique of asking the questions as numbers, um, granted, it is single blind, but that just means that someone else has got to come along and do a double blind study. And then someone else has got to come and do a triple blind study. Uh, you know, that's the way science works. No one study is going to, uh, that's what Carl Sagan with his extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. That just poisoned the well. That is so untrue. Science moves brick by brick, by study by study. Our study has to be built on by other people. Our study has to be picked apart in all of its flaws, and then someone else has to say, okay, so let's now study it when we've addressed these flaws. And that's the way science progresses.
Certainly, and one of the most core key principles of science and the progression of science is replication, and as you say,
Exactly.
advancement on faulty or unoptimized practice.
So I'm just I know I only have a few minutes left with you, so I'm gonna sum it all up. All right, here's the deal. Um, we like to call our study the first truly scientific study, just for a bit of dramatic hyperbole. However, in 2022, a group of scientist mediums, Brazil has scientist mediums,
Mm. Is that
and
Michael Gauner?
I can't remember the author, but that sounds right. But they are scientists who are spiritists or mediums, well trained. Um, One of them, Julio Perez, has done much of the uh, showing that mediums' brains process information differently, like automatic writing processed in a different area of the brain than ordinary writing, that kind of thing. And they said they reviewed the literature in 2022, and they said it is not convincing. What needs to be done are blinded studies. And we read that and we accepted the challenge. We presented our um, mediums with numbers and they answered the questions. And there can't be any doubt. Anyone wants to review our transcripts, they're welcome to do it. And of course, the Bigelow Foundation has them all. But basically, when we give a number to a medium and the number says, has mankind failed to spiritually progress in the last 150 years, and who's to blame, and looks back at us and says, progress is failure and can only occur with failure. You're misunderstanding the situation. You must fail in order to progress. Obviously, they're answering the question. We then have shown a coherent scientific model, uh, well over 200 references from the main scientific literature documenting all of the 6 points that I told you must be necessary for mediumship to be real. And we even gave an idea of best practices for mediums. We think that mediums should, before they attempt to contact the cluster of information that's a human being, they should show us that they can remote view. Because obviously we can't verify if they're actually, but if they're not able to contact the cluster of information that's the Eiffel Tower when they're given a arbitrary number, then we're they need to show us that first. Um, and they have to be able to influence the flow of electrons with their mind. And again, the research on that's a whole nother show, but that comes out of Princeton University, uh, funded by the aerospace giant McDonnell Douglas. Those are the kinds of people that study the issue of can the human mind alter the flow of electrons. Douglas funded it because they found that fighter pilots were interfering with the sophisticated equipment in the cockpits. And that's why they asked Princeton and Jan, who is the lead scientist on that, professor emeritus of the Department of Engineering. Again, there's no question about it. And what Dr. Jan and his associate Roger Nelson did was they then showed that profound states of meditation, the ability to remote view. We even showed that when rate are actually doing something, we can measure raising the white count of a patient with a low white count. In addition, as a correlation, not causation, uh, they can influence the flow of electrons in a true random number generator. So, so we established standards for our mediums. We presented our mediums the questions in a blinded manner. And Aaron, we were funded. We were funded up front. We didn't care what the answers were. We had no horse in the race. Whatever answer they gave us, uh,
Would have been reported.
we were going to report.
Mm.
And yet their answer is one that I think needs to be heard because it's the same answer as a near death experience. And that is that this school, excuse me, reality is a school where we're to learn highly complex lessons of love, the death of a child, the horrors of Gaza. Those are complicated lessons of love. And however, if we don't learn to love, the message is clear. We're at the brink of self extinction. If we burn our house down, we're not going to be learning any lessons of love. And that message came through loud and clear. And the entities, and these are the highest of entities, the I am. Uh, you know, uh, I mean, the all that is one. These are the types of entities they contacted. And their answer was clear that, you know, now is the time to start to learn to love or face self extinction. And that they actually, uh, according to what they told our mediums, again, in response to numbers, not questions, that they themselves inspired this study, that they themselves uh, influenced Mr. Bigelow so that they could bring this message to us. And, it's time for us to learn to love, that's for sure.
For sure. It's just a shame. We wish that these messages could go through because it's not the regular person that's causing all the issues.
Okay, so we asked the mediums that question, and you're right. They said they work on the individual level. They try to influence the individual. That what they call life are usually people in our communities, that are helping out, that are, doing the recycling, the paper drives, the getting food to, the shut-ins. That those are the people that are hearing the spirit world, and that the people in power, and they don't even see that as their responsibility. They took no responsibility for uh, tragedy, basically. They see that as human based. That one of the questions basically was, "Who's to blame for all this?" And they said, "You are." You know, um, in fact, they hinted that they would trigger wars because they felt that those were learning opportunities for humans. But they did not anticipate, you know, one that came back again and again was that science relied on spiritual inspiration or felt at least that they were discovering um, God's plan in this reality. And I mean, from the inventor of the thermometer to discovery of circulation, the human body, etc. These people were considered spiritual and their peers, and that ethic has disappeared. Scientists are no longer, trying to see if what they're learning was truly inspired, or is it something that they developed on their own.
Or even if it was, if they believe it was spiritually inspired, they're too afraid to say.
I agree that the phenomena of the conversation at the pub from a scientist is very different than the conversation in the conference room. I don't want anybody. We want to get this message out there, and so I don't want anybody to think that they have to buy our book or any of that stuff. Our book is our report, and then we put in commentaries with Raymond Moody, John Alexander, very well known. He's did much of the military for UFOs, and he's just a thoughtful guy. Anybody can download our report from the Bigelow Institute of Studies uh, website, or they can go to the website, which is isscusa.org, and you can download the report from there. Because really, you know, the results of our report were unanticipated, and we had no idea what the answers would be, nor did we care. We really, as you can tell, we're preoccupied with our scientific protocols and theories. And, to us, this was just a wonderful opportunity uh, to advance our scientific mediumship. But the answers we got need to be read by everybody.
And I'll put a link to the report in the description of this video as well.
I think that's so important because I'm tired of all these snarky comments. Oh, yeah, they just want to make a buck. First of all, all this money goes to fund our research. And second of all, download it yourself